Welcome to episode 228 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Laws Guy. It's June 16, 1950, Rio de Janeiro. A new stadium opens, not quietly, not modestly, not as a useful municipal facility, but as a declaration, the Maracanã, or at the time, the Estadio Municipal, a concrete bowl built for the World Cup, built for nearly 200,000 people, built for a country that wanted to tell the world it was no longer a football participant. It had become a football civilization. And today, before the World Cup begins, the stadium gets its first match, a Rio de Janeiro selection against the Sao Paulo selection. The score is almost secondary, because the real result is architectural. Brazil has built the biggest football stage on earth. But how did we get here? We start with the absence. The World Cup has not been played since 1938. The 1942 and 46 tournaments were swallowed by the Second World War. Europe was devastated. Economies were damaged. Cities were rebuilding. Federations were unstable. Travel was hard. Money was short. And FIFA's great global tournament, still young, still fragile, needed to be resurrected. Brazil had already been a serious candidate for the cancelled 1942 tournament. After the war, at the FIFA Congress in Luxembourg in July 1946, Brazil offered to host, with one key condition, not 1949 as had been discussed, but give us 1950. That gave Brazil time, not much time, but time enough to imagine something enormous. The 1950 World Cup would be the fourth World Cup, the first after the war, the first in 12 years, and for Brazil it would be more than a tournament, it would be a national exhibition. Brazil in the 1940s is formally democratic again after the Estado Novo dictatorship of Getúlio Vargas. Eurico Gaspar Dutra is president. Rio de Janeiro is still the federal capital. The country wants modernity, roads, factories, urban expansion, radio, newspapers, sport and spectacle. And football is the perfect language. Brazil had already produced extraordinary players. Leonidas had made global headlines in 1938. Clubs in Rio and Sao Paulo were powerful cultural institutions. The national team was admired, but not yet world champion. So hosting the World Cup becomes a way to say, we are ready. But if Brazil is going to host the world, Rio needs a stadium worthy of the claim. At first, the question is political, as much as architectural. Where should it go? Carlos Lacerda, a fierce political voice and enemy of Rio Mayor Angelo Mendes de Moraes, criticizes the expense and the location. He prefers building far out in Jacarepaguá, or else want a more central urban monument. Sports journalist Mário Filho becomes one of the great advocates for the stadium. So does the broadcaster and composer Ari Barroso. The final site is the old Derby Club, a former horse racing track in the Maracanã district in Rio's North Zone. That location matters. It's not Copacabana. It's not simply postcard Rio. It is closer to the working city, the railway city, the city of commuting supporters. The stadium is meant to be big, public, reachable, and democratic, at least by the standards of its time. The design is given to a team of Brazilian architects, Valdir Ramos, Rafael Galvão, Miguel Feldman, Oscar Valdetaro, Orlando Acevedo, Pedro Paulo Bernardes Bastos, and Antonio Dias Caneiro. Engineer Paulo Pinheiro Guedes is also central to the project. The idea is a vast oval concrete bowl, ramps, terraces, a ring of humanity, a stadium not designed for intimacy, but for mass, for 200,000. But why so many? Because the World Cup demanded a stage, because Rio demanded a monument, because football in Brazil was already capable of producing crowds that felt less like audiences and more like populations, and because this was mid-century modern ambition. Build big, build fast, build a future people can see. The cornerstone is laid on August 2, 1948. That leaves less than 2 years before the first World Cup match, less than 2 years to build the biggest stadium on the planet. And you can guess what happens. The project runs late, it goes over budget. There are arguments about cost, politics, and public priorities. FIFA grows anxious enough that Ottorino Barassi, the Italian administrator who had helped organize the 1934 World Cup, is sent to Rio to assist and push the process along. Workers pour concrete, ramps rise, the bowl takes shape, and in the final months, thousands of workers are pushed into the race against the calendar. And still, when June 1950 arrives, the stadium is not truly finished. There are still areas, still rough, facilities incomplete, press arrangements imperfect, toilets inadequate, construction still visible. Maracanã is playable before it's complete. In fact, it won't be fully completed until 1965. But on June 16, 1950, Brazil doesn't wait. The stadium opens. There are ceremonies, officials, bands, speeches, and expectation. Then the football. Seleção Carioca against Seleção Paulista. The Rio selection against the Sao Paulo selection. The first goal is scored by Didi, then a young Fluminense midfielder, not selected for Brazil's 1950 World Cup squad, but destined to become one of the great brains of Brazilian football and the player of the tournament in 1958. Didi makes it 1-0 for Rio. Then Sao Paulo answer. Augusto equalizes. Ponce de Leon makes it 2-1. Augusto scores again. Sao Paulo win 3-1. The largest stadium in the world has begun with a comeback. But so what? The verdict in the days after the opening is almost contradictory. Maracanã is unfinished. Everyone can see that. But it's already overwhelming. The country has not built a perfect stadium. It has built an unavoidable one. 8 days later, the World Cup arrives. June 24, 1950, Brazil against Mexico. The first competitive match at Maracanã. Brazil win 4-0. Ademir scores the first competitive goal there, and he also scores a second. Jair and Baltazar also gets on the scoreboard. The crowd is roughly 80,000, enormous anywhere else, but almost a warm-up in this place. Then Maracanã goes into the tournament. Brazil beat Yugoslavia 2-0 there to win the group. And then comes the final round. Remember, 1950 has no single final. It has a 4-team final group: Brazil, Uruguay, Spain, and Sweden. Brazil demolished Sweden 7-1 at Maracanã, then Spain 6-1. The stadium is now not just full, it is convinced. Brazil are not merely winning, they're performing a coronation. Then July 16, Brazil against Uruguay. Brazil need only a draw. Official attendance 173,850, but the number that lives in popular memory just around 200,000, some estimates even higher. Whatever number you choose, the meaning is the same: a city, a country, and a dream packed inside one stadium. Brazil lead through Friacha. Uruguay equalize through Juan Alberto Schiaffino. Then Alcides Gigia scores. Uruguay 2, Brazil 1. The Maracanazo, the silence. The wound that turns the stadium from a monument into a myth. And yes, we'll of course talk about that in its own episode of OTD. And here's a strange thing about Maracanã. If Brazil had beaten Uruguay, the stadium may have been remembered as a triumphal palace. Because Brazil lost, it became something more complicated. Temple with a ghost. From there, Maracanã becomes one of the few stadiums in world football whose history is almost too large for one episode. In 1951 and 52, it becomes the great revenue machine of Rio football. Flamengo, Fluminense, Vasco, and Botafogo all make it their stage. The Fla-Flu rivalry becomes a mass ritual there. In 1963, Flamengo and Fluminense draw a crowd often listed above 190,000, still one of the greatest club attendances in history. In 1969, Pelé scores his 1,000th career goal there, a penalty for Santos against Vasco. The match stops. The crowds flood into his mythology. In 1989, Brazil beat Uruguay at Maracanã to win the Copa America, the first Brazilian Copa America title since 1949, and a neat emotional echo of 1950, even if nothing can truly erase 1950. In 2000, the first FIFA Club World Cup championship ends there, with Corinthians beating Vasco on penalties in an all-Brazilian final. Then comes the era of renovation. The old Maracanã changes. The Geral, the cheap standing area that helped make it a People's Stadium, disappears. Capacity falls. Seats replace concrete mass. Safety and comfort improve. Something is gained, something is lost. For the 2007 Pan American Games, the stadium is modernized again. And for the 2014 World Cup, it is rebuilt into a global arena. Roof, seats, hospitality, media, access, and safety. Modern Maracanã hosts the final. Germany 1, Argentina 0. Götze in extra time. Messi walking past the trophy. In 2016, Maracanã hosts the opening and closing ceremonies of the Rio Olympics and the Olympic football final, where Brazil finally win men's Olympic gold by beating Germany on penalties. Then the warning sign. After the Olympics, the stadium falls into disrepair amid disputes over management and maintenance, broken seats, damaged facilities, a pitch allowed to deteriorate. The most famous stadium in Brazil looking abandoned only months after the world had watched it glitter. That is Maracanã too. Grandeur and neglect, public monument and public argument, sacred space and expensive liability. And then it returns. In 2021, Argentina beat Brazil 1-0 at Maracanã in the Copa America final, giving Lionel Messi his first senior international trophy. In 2023, Fluminense beat Boca Juniors there to win their first Copa Libertadores. For Fluminense, one of Maracanã's own clubs, the stadium becomes not trauma, but fulfillment. And today, Maracanã is still there, smaller than the old monster, more controlled, more commercial, but less democratic in the old sense, but still carrying the aura. Does any stadium in the world compare? A few can enter the conversation. Wembley, because it has the 1923 White Horse Final, 1966 the FA Cup, England, Empire and pop culture, though the original was demolished and the new Wembley carries memory more than concrete. The Azteca, because it staged the 1970 and 86 World Cup finals, Pelé's Brazil, Maradona's Argentina, the game of the century, the hand of God, the goal of the century. And only last week, it became the first stadium to host matches in 3 men's World Cups. The Monumental in Buenos Aires, because of River Plate, Argentina 1978, dictatorship, ticker tape, and national mythology. San Siro in Milan belongs in that pantheon. Lusail? Not yet in my opinion. It has Messi's 2022 final, perhaps the greatest final ever, but aura needs time. Maracanã has time, and mass, and pain, and Pelé, and Didi, and Flamengo and Fluminense, and Brazil, and 1950. And that is why June 16, 1950 matters, because today is not only the opening of a stadium, it is the opening of a stage on which Brazil will perform its dreams, its joy, its contradictions, and its most famous silence. Before we go, 3 things to take away from June 16, 1950. First, Maracanã was born from post-war ambition. Brazil wanted the World Cup to announce a modern nation, and Rio answered with the largest football stadium on earth. Second, it opened unfinished, imperfect, and already irresistible. The building was late, over budget, and incomplete, but it immediately became bigger than its flaws. And third, Maracanã's greatness comes from contradiction. It is not only a cathedral of Brazilian football, it is a democratic dream, a political dispute, a renovation battlefield, a club stage, an international theater, and the home of the loudest silence football has ever known. On this day in 1950, Maracanã opened in Rio de Janeiro, a stadium built for the World Cup, built for nearly 200,000 people, and built to become one of the most famous football arenas in the world. That is all for episode 228 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Lost Guy. I have a favor to ask of you. Once you've done listening to this episode, and if you haven't done it already, please rate the show 5 stars. The algorithm will then push OTD in front of more people. And of course, if you have an idea for the show, my email is otd@17lawsguy.com. Tomorrow, we go to June 17, 1970, Italy 4, West Germany 3, the game of the century, a World Cup semi-final, extra time chaos, and Franz Beckenbauer playing with his arm in a sling. See you then.